Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise. This is our regular Tuesday lunchtime open news meeting, and you may be, if you are regulars, more used to seeing James here. James is, I think probably it's fair to say, taking part in the grand competition to see who can get hottest in Europe. I won't reveal his geographical location. He's having a well-earned break, so you're stuck with me today. As you know, if you've come to one of these Tuesday thinkings before, try to use it as an expanded open version of a newspaper's regular news conference. But they do that every day. We do this once a week. Try to take a step back, exhale if you can in the heat, and decide what we think is important, what we need to be focusing on, and what aspects of the big stories we need to be concentrating on within that. We've had some thoughts, and as usual, they're in the Tortoise news list, which you can see in the app. It's been prepared by my colleague Ella Hill and fine-tuned possibly by Pete Hoskin. It was a joint effort. And you can see that we are looking at the mounting increasingly urgent refugee question. I'm not going to use the crisis. I think it'd be ridiculous to use the word crisis involving refugees crossing the Channel from France to England. We're looking, as we were for much of last week and last month, Donald Trump's assault on anything Chinese, but in particular TikTok and other Chinese apps. I'm particularly interested in the unfolding situation in Belarus, and I'm hoping that we may be able to speak with Alida Naylor, who is an author on Russia and the Baltics and something of an expert on what's going on in Belarus. Our news list also covers the collapsed government in Beirut. In principle, there will be elections there. We don't know when, we don't know who will stand. The entire government has resigned. And we're also looking, of course, at the looming exam results. I think I might use the word fiasco here. I have skin in the game. I have a son who couldn't take his A-levels. He's on tenterhooks. 48 hours to go. What on earth is going to happen? Also on our news list under the wealth heading is the question of executive pay, whether as one of the long run results of COVID, the long run increase in executive pay might have actually have hit a peak. So I'm hoping to get to at least three of those things, and probably starting with Belarus in a second. But please remember that this is your chance as members of an open newsroom to pitch in with what you think we may be missing or neglecting. I mean, for example, is 20 million COVID cases a significant deadline? My own view, we've just passed that number. My own view is that in and of itself, 20 million is not a significant number, but the rate at which we have gone from 10 to 20 compared with from 0 to 10 million as a species, taking the planet as a whole, is pretty scary. Is that going to go on up exponentially, or will we get again, as a species, will we get a grip on it over the next couple of months? A breaking news story this morning, Putin claims that Russia has a serviceable COVID vaccine. The immediate response is to be somewhat skeptical. We know that they have not done phase 3 clinical trials, if they've even done proper phase 2 clinical trials. But are we being reflexively unfair? Might we have seen a Russian medical miracle? There's always another story rumbling along in the back of my head, which is Trump in fact going to win re-election? I think Biden's lead is softening. Any of those issues or anything else, please pitch in. We really want to know what you think is important and what aspects of these stories you think we should be covering. For those of you who may not know how to do this, there are two ways. You can talk in the chat, and I see that some of you are already talking in the chat, where my colleague James Wilson is monitoring what everybody's saying. And there we go, the nonchalant Wilsonian wave. And you can click on the participants button and find your digital hand in the bottom right-hand corner. I've never quite understood why when I click on the participants button, I don't get one, but I guess that's because I'm doing this and I can just rabbit on. Anyway, one other thing that I wanted to mention before we get started, if any of you were at last night's thinking on rent, and specifically the private rented sector in the age of COVID, and have had any views overnight on what angles we should be pursuing there, whether about regulation for the private rented sector or Airbnb, please do let us know. But without more ado, because we've got something that feels a bit like a revolution or a precursor to a revolution happening in a big country that we go for years at a time without talking about, even though it's part of Europe, in Belarus. I wanted to see if we could come to a leader, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing your first name. Hi.
Hi.
Great to see you.
Brainy, apologies.
You're in Ukraine?
No, I'm in London at the moment.
Okay, great. It is a leader.
Yes, a leader. Following a leader.
Thanks so much for joining us. And full disclosure, I've not yet had the pleasure of reading your book, The Shadow in the East, which is principally about the Baltics and their relationship, their complex relationship with Putin's Russia, as I understand it. But right below the Baltics, of course, is Lukashenko's little empire. And I'd like to start just by getting your take on what the heck's going on there and what is likely to ensue. The last check-in I was able to have with the news was a rather moving piece to camera that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is the de facto opposition leader, did apparently from a room in Lithuania to which she fled yesterday, saying basically, this is not worth the loss of any human life. One person has died already. What does that mean, do you think? Has she thrown in the towel? Where do we go from here?
There seems to be a little bit of ambiguity about where exactly she's done that at the moment. But if we are to believe that it is in Lithuania still, then, I mean, there were two videos that came out, I believe. One was quite tearful, and then there was another one where she was on a dark sofa with a white background. I think primarily we need to think about two things here. One is that her husband is still obviously in custody in Belarus. He was basically the reason why she was standing essentially in his place in the first place. And also she has children. Now, we don't know whether she is worried about them at the moment, but obviously the fact that she has family that may or may not still be in the country and or at risk could be an issue right now for her. And it's not unheard of, at least. I mean, Belarus and Russia obviously aren't the same country either, but it's not unheard of in the Russian Federation, at least, their family members to be targeted by security forces. So I think that's something to consider. I was interested in the fact that you termed it a revolution, because I find this situation in Belarus to be very disorganized, and of course revolutions so far historically have had some sort of leadership, it seems. Mm-hmm. And this has all been very, I suppose, very spontaneous and somewhat anarchic. So it will be very interesting to see if there is a kind of organized element that's going to take hold within the country, even though Svetlana is outside right now.
I completely accept that revolution was probably premature. I just wonder if it's right to regard this as a tipping point in some way. I saw on Twitter one former member of a Lukashenko government, I think a former advisor to Lukashenko, saying
Yeah.
there's something different about him now. He looks frightened. And I think the concern there was that rubber bullets would turn to live rounds when the animal's cornered, as it were. In your view, this is his sixth term, which in principle he's just
Yeah.
won. But has he won it on different terms? And is everybody more at risk as a result?
Well, he's been in power since 1994, I believe. So a really, really long time. And as you know yourself, he's got the moniker, the last dictator. It's the last dictatorship in Europe, whether fairly or unfairly. I mean, obviously there are one or two others. But I lost my train of thought going back to the question. Yes, so this time around he does seem a little bit more concerned than he has in the past. And the fact that perhaps the only thing he has to rely on is the use of force right now is quite dangerous. I mean, he's been accusing foreign actors of coming into the country or like stoking the protests without any real evidence. The showing on the street is more than enough to kind of suggest that he did not get the 80% of the votes that he claimed that he had. And now, I mean, as a dictator, then his only real, I suppose, motivation right now is to stay in power. And whether he is going to be able to do that through any means but force is very, very questionable. And I believe there have already been people who have spotted security forces wielding live rounds. Whether they've been used or not remains unclear, but there's still been a great deal of violence. And I think 1 to 3 deaths already. Possibly 2 of those are near deaths or like potentially fatal casualties, but 1 confirmed death so far.
How do you think Putin will want to play this? Because on the one hand, he doesn't want, presumably, the Russian people to see the Belarusian people overthrow an authoritarian leader on his doorstep. But on the other hand, as I understand it, he has fairly undisguised contempt for Lukashenko as a person. So, and there's not much sign of him offering support, tacit or otherwise, as he did to a series of Ukrainian leaders, on condition that they side broadly with Moscow.
They've been doing a kind of strange dance with each other for the past couple of years, I suppose, based on, I mean, there are various factors in terms of their energy relationship and political relationship and a potential like regional cooperation with Russia and some other post-Soviet states. I mean, they'd both like to stay in power, and up until this point, it's been kind of a mutually beneficial relationship, in my opinion, even though they don't necessarily trust one another completely. As you said, like a little bit of mutual animosity there. But also the fact that it could be it could lead to something along the lines of his overthrow can be quite worrying to Putin. I mean, I think people in Khabarovsk, where there are also protests in Russia's Far East, they've been coming out in support of Belarus too. So there are some kind of cross-border elements that could be worrying.
Now, I need to unpack this a little bit, to use that cliche, because just for people who haven't been paying attention to in politics in the Russian Far East, there have been big anti-Putin demonstrations in support of a local governor in Khabarovsk region, is that right? Who had the temerity to stand up to the central government and was then removed from office.
Yes, and he has overwhelming popular support, I believe.
Right. And those protesters are now back on the streets in solidarity with the anti-Lukashenko group.
They've expressed some support to the Belarus protesters, so there just seems to be some cross-border sympathy against maybe over-aggressive power in the region.
Right. Oh, but there's a wonderful symmetry to that. Well, if you're a casual observer like me and sort of quietly hoping for a reordering of authority in the Russian Empire and a drift back to where we hoped we would all go after 1991. Is it wishful thinking to suggest that Putin's authority is finally crumbling at both ends of the empire?
I mean, I think there's like a wonderful, here in the quote unquote West, we always seem to be kind of looking for or waiting for, I suppose, the Russian government to fall or the Belarusian government to fall or these authoritarian regimes in the East to fall, but they've always restructured and they've always survived in some sense. You know, after the Russian Revolution, we had the Soviet system, after the Soviet system, we had Putin's government. So whether what comes next is going to be something that's better or worse, who could really say, and whether that's going to happen at all still remains to be seen. It's still a question that I don't know the answer to.
Right. No, I mean, you're absolutely right that that seems to be the big picture. Though, I mean,
yeah.
the Baltics, which you've written about, I suppose they had a separate history up until 1917 and have been able, in a sense, to return to that. But one other thing I wanted to ask before we move on is what the EU should be doing now. Because as I recall from the way it handled the departure of Yanukovych from Ukraine, there was arguably a moment there when, in sort of Trumpian terms, the EU could have made a bid for Ukraine, and it didn't bid high enough, and Putin bid higher, and the next chapter in Ukrainian history unfolded along those lines. Is there what is the smart play for the EU now if it wants to do the grown-up thing of encouraging the growth of a democratic opposition without fueling the narrative of foreign meddling?
That's a very big question. How to solve the problem in Belarus right now?
Right.
I don't think it could do anything without being accused of foreign meddling right now. But at the same time, waiting to see how events unfold from the outskirts is going to also pose a problem if it's just going to kind of erupt into violence. I do see it as different from Ukraine in the sense that Ukraine was already kind of pursuing the EU association agreement.
Yes, of course.
And there were kind of, Ukraine had certain kind of oppositional elements over the years. Like it had a colour revolution in the past. It had opposition in government too, and there was a kind of long-term organised, semi-organised element, sort of grew in a different direction to what's happening in Belarus at the moment. So it's going to, how events in Belarus unfold is going to be completely unique, I suppose, in a sense. Yeah, how would you solve it?
Well, a lot depends, doesn't it, on the actual level of support for Lukashenko in Ukraine and the actual extent to which people still believe anything that he says. Because while 80% is clearly a rigged result, a bit like Putin himself, it's naive to think that he doesn't command sort of some large level of residual, if grudging support. You know, the number may be more than 50, maybe more than 60. And I suppose in that event, the foreign meddling narrative would find some traction. But is there an equivalent, do you know, in Belarus of, what's it called? There's one credible polling organization in Russia, which you will... Right. Do they operate in Minsk?
I don't think they do. I'll have to look up. I'll have to look it up to see whether there is actually a credible polling organisation. So I won't waste your time watching me search. But if there is, then it would be interesting to see the results of that. If they believe Tikhanovskaya was also claiming around 80% of the vote, which seems also vastly over-exaggerated. So as always, maybe the truth is somewhere in between.
Right. Well, look, thank you very much. Before we leave Belarus, I just want to ask Mehdi in the chat when you're talking about our responsibility is generally limited to regime change and blanket bombing of their cities, I know there's a parallel discussion going on already in the chat about refugees, but are you talking about Belarus or something else, something completely different? Mehdi Asghari. Can we unmute Mehdi, please?
Is that better?
Yes, yes.
No, I made that comment with respect to your earlier comment with regard to the, I know you don't like the word crisis, but the immigration event, let's say.
Okay.
Boats coming across the channel, across the Indian Channel. And it's really been a long time coming that we should have actually expected to reap what we actually sowed. These are the results of the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and 2 years previous to that, how we actually behaved in Afghanistan.
Okay.
So if we expect to go and invade people's country, seek regime change, and do blanket bombing of the cities and the civilians, we should expect some sort of a kickback. One thing in the Lebanese events, crisis, if you like, that goes unnoticed or uncommented upon. There is about 5 million of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Okay, a country with all its problems, they actually have got to manage is either the number is 3 or 5 million of Syrian refugees. And when we actually initiate involvement in far-flung countries, we ought to actually also consider the implication of what we do. That is the context I offered my.
Okay, Mehdi's frozen on me. I'm sorry that we just missed the end of that, Mehdi, but he's moved us on pretty decisively from Belarus to what's happening on the other side of the EU, namely the refugee question in the Channel. William, you've got your hand up. Let me briefly come to you, just briefly, because I don't want to sort of lose track of what we're doing. But did you want to comment on Belarus before we moved on?
Yes, it was just an observation on the whole of what you call the Russia relations with what used to be called the West, in that I was having a listen to one of the old episodes of Alistair Cook's Letter from America and was much struck by one that he did from the early 90s when Putin first got elected as president, I think, and I don't know, it was 92, 93. And
that wouldn't have been Putin, but
would that have been prime minister?
Putin, prime minister in 99 and president in 2000.
Oh no, 2000. Yes. Yep. Sorry, I'm a decade out. That's true. He made a speech in what, 2000-ish, when he gave notice almost, when he praised the KGB and the OGPU and the whole history of the secret police. And he almost gave notice of the kind of ruler he'd be, which harked back to the Tsarist times as well as the Soviet times. And I just wonder whether we sort of didn't take him as seriously as we should have done then. And again, whether we've all been slightly deluding ourselves that, you know, reform would happen because it was all hoping to go in the right direction because of what happened with Yeltsin, and, you know.
Yeah, I was there then, and if there was a collective delusion, I was part of it. But I think you're right that you can easily become captured by a mindset of an assumption of progress of some sort, and as our very own Chris Cook often reminds us, things really can get worse and go on getting worse. And they may be doing just that. Let me ask you Daniel and Sarah, you've got your hands up. Let's keep it brief so we can get as many people involved as quickly. Are we still on Belarus, Daniel? No, you're shaking your head.
No, I'm afraid not. It'll be the examinations.
All right, we'll come to that.
We'll do that now, slightly later.
We'll come to that a bit later on, if you don't mind. I just wanted first to turn to the situation in the Channel, because and by the way, Alida, thank you so much. And I don't know if you can stay with us until the end of the hour, but the question that I have about all these subjects is how should we at Tortoise address them? And I think you have views on that. So if you're still around, I'll come back to you on that. But we have a total of about 4,000 refugees who've set off from the French side of the Channel so far this year in small boats for the UK. I cannot resist comparing that with 1 million refugees who entered Germany in 2015. No change of leadership there since then. That country managed to absorb them with political upheavals, but one way or another. We have a UK Home Secretary seeking a role for the Navy, others, including in her own government and the UK Armed Forces, saying that that's potty, preposterous, ridiculous. But she has nonetheless named as Britain's first clandestine Channel threat commander, Dan Mahoney, who was a Royal Marine. So it's kicking off, at least as a newspaper story. And the question is, what should be done about it? A junior minister said this morning, we shouldn't suggest there are any simple or easy answers to this. That was Helen Whately, who often gets mocked for being put on the spot and saying the wrong thing, but actually she must be right about that. Ella Hill, my colleague Ella Hill, actually put this on the news list. What do you think, Ella, if you're around, are the sort of basic questions that that need to be addressed? I mean, I'm thinking really in policy terms. Even if we don't have the answers, what are the questions?
I would say that the question of responsibility is raised by this. You know, the French are saying that they can't do what the British want them to do, which is to stop these boats, and the UK government is sending in the Navy to prevent these boats from landing if they can. And I think that France has taken in many more and gets many more asylum applications than the UK does, almost, actually more than twice as many last year. And we make it very difficult for people to claim asylum unless they are in the UK. So I suppose those are some of the key points that I would want to think about.
Right. I mean, as David Miliband said in an interview I saw with Times Radio, the government that we have, largely as a result of the Take Back Control slogan, is now asking to share control of that border with France. And I noticed the Times itself in an editorial focusing very tightly on better cooperation with France as the answer. But that in itself, and I know that having in a previous life written leaders for the Times, is just dodging the actual granular detail of the question. And Zav Greenwood, if you're around, I'm wondering if you have any silver bullet answers. And that's a bit of an ask, but I just could tee you up with something I noticed from the MP for Pas-de-Calais, Pierre-Henri Dumont, who actually seems to come up with something quite sensible, even though the UK government won't like it, which is allow asylum seekers who want to apply for asylum in the UK to do so while they're still in France. And you thereby avoid the dangerous crossings and remove from traffickers a big business opportunity. Is anything in that, or what do you think the solution is?
Well, I think we did kind of have that until March, because we had the refugee resettlement scheme, so you could process claims without having to present yourself, and that was suspended in March because of COVID, and that had been, you know, fairly successful. I think it had resettled about 15,000 people up until this year.
How did that work again?
Another 5,000 people, and then they suspended it in March, and they haven't reinstated it. I mean, there's the government's always coming up with the wrong solution. You know, the solution is not to make the Channel crossing even more dangerous, is to make it a safe crossing. Because if you try and make it kind of unviable for you know, asylum seekers to cross legally, then all you're doing is allowing smugglers to exploit asylum seekers and refugees even more. And I mean, Mady made the point earlier, and I think we shy away from talking about responsibility in a kind of historical sense, because it feels like it just goes into a kind of historical debate about what the UK is responsible for. But he's completely right. I think Daniel Trilling in The Guardian looked at 120 people who were intercepted in the Channel on the 4th of August, and they came from Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Pakistan, Palestine, Sudan, and Yemen. 2 countries invaded by the UK recently, one which is in famine by a Saudi bombardment which uses British weapons, one in a prolonged conflict with Israel, which is also a UK ally, and all the others, you know, persecutes ethnic and social groups. And just on this particular, you know, so-called crisis, I think it's worth saying, one, that the pandemic has made other routes into the UK more unviable, and it's very good weather, and there's a seasonality to you know, refugee crossing. So that partly explains why there's more people now trying to cross over. It doesn't help either that we fund Ride Police in Calais, who make conditions in Calais completely unviable for refugees. I mean, there's always this talk about why do refugees not stay in a safe country, you know, on the way, instead of going all the way to the UK. The truth is, we designate as safe countries for refugees countries which aren't really safe. France is not really a safe country for refugees because of their behaviour, which we fund. I think.
Wait, Zav, can you expand on their behaviour?
Well, on the fact that Riot Police forcibly empty informal camps in Calais. They use rubber bullets, they use tear gas, they use batons on asylum seekers and on children. I think the UK has helped fund through I can't remember the name of the agreement, but through an agreement it has with France, funds these kind of huge fences and walls in the Calais camps. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that, and also I think the European Court of Human Rights about a week ago said that France also treats asylum seekers in an inhuman way. So I just don't think it's too much to ask to expect that people who are undertaking a very dangerous journey, which is potentially going to kill them, are doing so for a good reason. I don't know why it's unreasonable to start from that assumption. And as suggested earlier, we have the capacity to start from that assumption because we have a very low percentage of our country that are refugees. We have the capacity to process these claims. We have the capacity to show compassion. And yet the government just wants to turn it into another kind of culture war argument, and the media, or lots of the media, have just kind of immediately jumped on that end and kind of engaged in it in that sense.
Thanks, Ev. Can I come to Sarah? I'm just gonna say Sarah MBK, because I don't know what MBK stands for.
It stands for Mubarak. So I'm from Beirut, that's why. But it's sometimes easier just to write this.
Okay. What was on your mind?
So initially, I just thought I would speak about Beirut, but this is really linked to the discussion that's happening now. We're talking about refugees crossing between France and the UK, but I'm sure we're all thinking about where those refugees initially come from. And I saw a discussion in the chat about, is it 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, or is it 3 or 4 million? I think the official numbers have to be, that Lebanon is really chaotic of a place, so it depends what you mean by refugee. You have lots of people that came over from Syria even before the crisis started, that settled in Lebanon. Lebanon is a tiny country with, as we've seen, a lot of corruption and lacking basic resources to, respond to the needs of its own population. And I'm really worried about what's happening now, because this is a real turning point. I think we've hit rock bottom. We always say we've hit rock bottom, but this is beyond imagination. And I think this is going to be a defining moment, not only for Lebanon, but also for the region and also the rest of the world. I mean, imagining all those people in a failed state, they're going to have to be looking for another place to go. And most of them look towards Europe.
What do you think would be the smart and illuminating way to approach the Beirut story for a newsroom like ours? And I mean, in light of the events of last week, on one level, it was a massive and deeply unfortunate explosion. But what do you think is the most interesting aspect of Lebanese societal governance that it has exposed? And yeah, that's the question.
I mean, a lot of people are saying that, I mean, no one can say that the explosion was a good thing, but I think it highlighted something that the Lebanese people have been crying out for a while now. We've been on the streets protesting since October. And we've been trying to scream to the world that our government is corrupt and will be the end of us. Now, the thing is, the government has resigned, but this doesn't really mean anything. It's a tiny, tiny victory, but they're already thinking of their next steps and how to make sure they're still in power. One thing to know is the president of Lebanon at the moment was a warlord during the civil war of 1975. So it was a 30-year civil war that happened. All of the people in power at the moment were actually the main contributors to that war back then. And so they have a lot of vested interest. They have a lot of dirt on each other. And they're protecting each other because they want to stay in power and they want to try to avoid being held accountable. One thing I think would be really interesting to look into is the interplay between, what's happening in Lebanon at the moment and the involvement of foreign powers. I'm sure you've seen that Macron visited the country 2 days after the blast, and it's shocking to see that people were calling for a new mandate, because France was actually, Lebanon was under the French mandate in the early 1900s, and so people are so desperate. They're calling for a French mandate again, because they're saying our government is just not taking care of us. They're putting us in danger. Now, the thing is, a lot of the population that was hit was a majority of everyone was hit because Beirut is the center, it's the capital, but the majority was Christian. And so you have a lot of regions in the south that support Hezbollah, that are seeing Macron's intervention as, foreign meddling in national affairs. And now you've got all countries, including Israel, that is meant to be officially at war with Lebanon, offering its help. So there's definitely a humanitarian side to it, but this is causing a lot of tensions internally because it's reviving sectarian tensions.
Mm-hmm. Because do you think Macron was hasty? Do you think he should have waited a bit, or I mean, clearly there's a deep and long-lasting relationship. No, you don't.
I definitely don't think he was hasty. I think, I mean, it's going to sound really harsh what I'm saying, but I think a lot of people would have committed suicide if he hadn't been there. There was a wave of suicides happening because Lebanon was in a very deep economic crisis. There were no jobs, lots of insecurity. The currency lost 85% of its value since last September. And people were starting to commit suicide in public spaces. And this explosion was the end of it. And the government didn't provide any help to the population. So Macron coming was, the hope and the support that the Lebanese people needed to, I won't even say keep going, but just try to survive, because they saw that, it's the first time that the international audience, the international powers and leaders are turning towards Lebanon and saying, okay, we're here to help you. So I think it was needed.
Thank you very much. Huge subject, not nearly enough time. I'm really sorry, but I'm glad that we came to you. And clearly there are linkages that span the continent and link the issue of Beirut's current torture and migration on the other side of Europe. Daniel, I promised I'd come to you, but let's be brief, because there's then we'll come to Nacho, and then I want to come to exams.
Yeah, so in terms of the examination process, so yeah, I'm waiting for results as well.
I got your exams. I've got to put you off again. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. I was forgetting. Nacho, you've been busy in the chat. What's on your mind?
Yeah, no, things that I find very amusing, all this rhetoric on returning the immigrants to France, etc. The thing is that, okay, the UK is using the rest of Europe as basically a border against immigrants. Many countries in Europe, including Spain or Germany, have been extremely generous integrating immigrants. The UK has followed anti-refugee policy, like opting out of the EU sharing of refugees. And the thing is that now they are not conscious that at least the government is not conscious that by leaving the EU, the rest of the world border moves from the Mediterranean to Dover.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the issue. And the thing is that now they pretend that they intend that France resolves the problems. The thing is that is totally hypocritical.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you make an excellent point.
The thing is that what's the incentive to the EU to? I was in the chat, for instance, taking about how shamelessly ineffective the police confinement and how they turn a blind eye to picnics or gatherings, etc. And something that is a culture of the police here in London. The thing that we have seen them running away from protesters in the last month. Like the thing is that there is a deep problem culture in the police. But the thing is that by that saying, what is the motivation for the EU authorities not the country authorities, the police in these different countries, just to turn a blind eye and just have all these people going all the way to Dover?
Nacho, if the UK were now to police its rest of world border down the middle of the channel in the same way as Spain has been policing its rest of world border, for example, off Ceuta and Melilla, what would we do?
Well, the thing is that as they would have, that Spain has done, they had first cooperated with the countries that the actual and the immigrants come from. The thing
Right.
is that Spain has reached deal with Mauritania. The thing is that there had been development investment, so for people having opportunities in those countries and not having to leave. And the thing is that the ones that are through asylum seekers, that they need to get protection, obviously they get it. And even those who don't. The thing is that there are a lot in Spain, there are a lot of refugee centers. The thing is that many times there are unaccompanied children, and the thing is that there are centers dedicated to take care of those children. And the thing is that maybe the UK, after being scandalized by having the amount of boat people that arrive to Spain in an afternoon, and maybe they should incorporate those mechanisms, helping those countries, putting refugee centers across the country, helping them to integrate, etc.
Thank you. I certainly think we have a reality check coming. Very briefly, before we go to Daniel, I see Ian Duffy in the chat is saying 2 issues, the biggest of which is the need for a workable and equitable framework for refugees and asylum. Ian, if you're near a microphone, what is your view? What's the unworkable aspect of it? Is it the time that a typical application takes, or is it that?
I think it's inconsistency, Giles. So at the moment, we have a model actually in Calais for operating a UK border in a different country. So there are ways you can think about this, but essentially, if you're going to have a system around kind of asylum claims and refugees, you need to have some consistency of it. So at the moment, what we've got is a very politicized non-policing of our existing borders and the blame game between sort of London and Paris.
Right.
What's going on? So in theory, if you have a kind of just and equitable approach to refugees and asylum, you should be able to apply for asylum and refugee status through the embassy in any country in any world, anywhere in the world. But that's not done consistently. You've then got to have the means of having that person having claimed asylum to be able to make that transit to the country that's accepting them, which could be miles away. That's the reality at the moment, where you've got displaced people coming out of North Africa, and as an example, and making their way over to the UK. So they're already trekking over an entire continent to get there.
Right. Okay.
But it's all kind of off book at the moment. So I don't have a kind of solution to this, other than just to point out there is a contradiction between the politicized non-policing of the borders at the moment versus what a better system should look like.
Clearly, a big gap between the two. Thanks. Right. Absurd as it may seem, I want to segue from people risking their lives on the channel to young people, the future of whose lives is at stake on Thursday. It is already apparent as a result of COVID that many thousands of Scottish school pupils who've taken hires are heartbroken with lower grades than they think they deserved, because they went to from poorer backgrounds or went to schools in poor neighborhoods, and they have been marked down by an algorithm. The Guardian is reporting that the same thing is going to happen on Thursday in England. And unlike in Scotland, individual English A-level students who didn't take their exams do not have a right of appeal. Their schools do, but it's a mess, isn't it? And I wanted to ask Matt D'Ancona, my colleague, or Liz, if either of them are around first, and Daniel, I promise we'll get to you, how we get out of the mess.
Thanks, Giles. Well, it was always going to be a mess, because I remember that day, it was March the 18th, Gavin Williamson announced there would be, along with the closure of schools, there'd be no GCSEs and A-levels. I have a son, I think you do, have a child who's going through this process, so it was always going to be messy. And to some extent, what amazed me is how this has illustrated that we don't necessarily need quite so regimented a system of standardized testing. However, what worries me about this is that I think a lot of people are going to suffer as a consequence of, in the downgrading, that were casino, as a consequence of what neighbourhoods they live in. It seems to me a great injustice that, generally speaking, people who live in less affluent areas, we're told, can expect to be downgraded almost algorithmically, which is both hard on those who live there as a general population, and particularly hard on those who are expected to outperform the average in those areas. So I think that's one problem. I'd like to, the first thing obviously is there must be an appeal system. And I think that I would suspect in the way of these things that there may be some movement on that, because quite rightly, examination results are a matter of great high emotion, and this is a government that responds to high emotion, and it may find it having to bend on this. More generally though, looking forward, I hope that we take some lessons from this about pencil and paper exams, and look more generally and holistically about how we test teenagers, because I think that it has illustrated that there may be a better hybrid system from the kind of grade factory through which we force teenagers now.
So do you think that's the way we should report it, is ask if in fact, in this as in so many other respects, COVID has revealed deeper problems, accelerated movement towards solutions, and we should be arguing for an alternative to A-levels altogether?
I think we should be looking at and asking why it is that a system that was essentially introduced in 1988 in the Education Reform Act is now out of date, and has become really just a means by which teenagers are taught to the test. I mean, it strangles creativity, it strangles critical thinking, and as a side issue, these are precisely the skills, the right side of the brain skills, that are going to be valuable as we move towards greater automation. So I think it's, first up, there are the problems of this year's cohort. We have to deal with them fast. On a longer term basis, I think we need to look at the lessons of what's happened and see it as an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Liz, when we were talking, Liz Mosley, when we were talking about this before, you were nodding your head. I don't know if you have skin in this particular game in terms of children, but do you agree with Matt? And specifically, what sort of story do you think Tortoise should be trying to report on the results mess?
Well, I was just briefly looking at the link that was shared a moment ago in the chat about how the grades are actually adjusted. My kids are too young, so my interest in schools at the moment is getting everybody back into primary school, and suddenly we think year sixes can spread in the way that adults can, year 6 and up. So I'm interested in what happens with primary schools up to year 5, and then suddenly year 6 you have to control differently. So kind of that's where my head is at in terms of school. I do have a niece that's getting results on Thursday, but it's hard for me to believe that there is a sort of Machiavellian, after all the warnings of it'll be the kids in the underprivileged areas that get walloped, after everybody was saying that from the very moment that the exams themselves were cancelled. I just can't believe that is the outcome, and there's been no sort of hand-wringing when the sort of big machine spews out the findings and they look at it and they go, are people going to kick off at this? I just can't believe that it can be that way. So for me, it really is about properly understanding what is the process, where are the human beings, where's the algorithm, who controls the algorithm. The algorithm doesn't write itself, right? It's the same with, whoops, sorry, we assumed that the doctor was a man, it's just the algorithm said that. The algorithm doesn't make that up by itself. So for me, I would really like to dismantle the process to understand where has there been a decision that is a judgment call, where has there been something else, and before sort of really going nuts about it. I mean, I know that doesn't help the people on Thursday. I get that, because people need to go to university if they're going, or crack on with an apprenticeship, or do whatever they're going to do. But I just can't believe that it would be allowed to just sort of roll on through and go, oh, well, your school's a bit shit, so we'll take you down to a C or whatever. I just don't believe that is the case.
No, but you're absolutely right. That's a great focus, and nice and specific. Who wrote the algorithm? Who made the calls? Let's see if we can do that. Daniel, thanks for your patience. We've got 4 minutes left. Don't use them all, but great to see you.
Yep. So yeah, of course, I am one of these students nervously results on Thursday. I just want to say one thing which I only learned this morning, because I'm actually going to do an interview with a broadcaster about this afternoon about these exact issues, which is that I only learned this morning that it's not actually an individual appeal in Scotland. The school still actually has to submit it. And that's actually one of the serious barriers that I'm kind of quite concerned about as well, because my school grades, what they predicted, I fear they'll be pessimistic. They've always been pessimistic. At Geography GCSE, they predicted me a 6 and I got a 9. So it kind of shows you kind of how low expectations were set in some cases. And in England as well, they're still charging for appeals. And it's a cohort-wide appeal, so it's everyone in the class, not just an individual, which is quite a problem. But yeah, I think that in terms of the model and stuff, because they kind of produced a model to calculate these grades, we don't actually know what's in the model. And that is a serious concern. I know the Royal Statistical Society have been calling for a review into this about what exactly they use, because they say it's historic data from the school. The teacher submitted grades only though if the cohort is less than 15, they discard them if the cohort's above 15. But they say other factors. And the horror stories from Scotland, of course, really make us nervous when you hear schools were getting 35% A's in a disadvantaged area, and then they got this year 5% A's. And it's like, that is not good. And it is going to have, you know, long-term effects on us. I mean, I've done a lot of access programs, and it could seriously be a social mobility disaster if it isn't sorted and fixed. So, yeah, I think there is a lot to think about. I actually think that in the long term, this system could work if they actually iron out some of these problems in terms of a proper, free and fair appeal system for the individual that allows each student to appeal themselves. And actually, if we make sure that what the system, because I think, to be honest, the system is a symptom of the problems we already have. It's not actually kind of producing barriers, rather than it's actually just replicating the barriers we already have. So it's about dismantling what's already the problem, so that actually, because I think it could be a fairer system if this works right.
Then A levels. Daniel, what are you hoping for?
So I mean, if I look at my mocks and what I was working at, I should get A star AAB.
What do you want to do with them?
So history and politics at Oxford University.
Well, very best of luck.
Thank you.
And I'm really intrigued by your suggestion that what has been forced upon us by a pandemic might actually be a model for the future. I have no doubt that if you had been forced through the ringer of the exams, you'd have done brilliantly. So we're all rooting for you. Thank you. Listen, I promised that I'd come back to Alida, because the question that I didn't ask is how you think we should be reporting, if you're still here, and I don't blame you if you're not, it's very hot. What one story should we be commissioning on Belarus?
I mean, that's a difficult situation when it comes to, I guess, trying to report on something that's going to be a slow-burning story. I don't know if you've heard of James Rogers. He just recently published a book called Reporting on Russia from Under Putin with the same publishing house as me. But basically throughout, he kind of outlines this disparity, I suppose, between the kind of need from the British press to have this kind of these short, punchy news hits versus the really kind of slow burning story and the change over time that's massive, that is going to take a long time to unfold. And I suppose Tortoise is actually kind of the optimal place for that, because it is slow news and it is going to be a slow burn. It's going to be a while before we see how this plays out. So maybe staying on, like you say, staying on the story, but maybe in a couple of weeks, maybe in a month, maybe when it becomes more obvious and more apparent what direction it's going to take.
Then we'd have more luck in working back through the events that have unfolded to figure out why. Yeah. Great, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. It's 2:01. I think Sarah suggested that we should look at the interplay between Lebanon and foreign powers with the examples, and I'm sure there are others, of Macron riding in 2 days after the explosion, and Israel officially an enemy offering help to Lebanon. I don't think we've necessarily got much closer towards resolving refugee issues in the Channel, but Nacho, I think your suggestion that the UK is in for a post-Brexit reality check as the rest of world border moves from the other side of Europe to the middle of the English Channel is really worth bearing in mind. Alida, yes, as Chu Enlai said, it was too early in the mid-20th century to reach a conclusion on the French Revolution, so it'll probably be still too early in 2 months' time to reach a conclusion on what's going on in Belarus, but certainly it may be coming into focus. And thank you for joining us. Thanks everyone for contributing. And last but not least, good luck again, Daniel. And you say that you're going to be here next week, so we'll find out how you've done. I look forward to that. Hope it goes well. Thanks everybody. See you soon.